today we're going to talk about lesson 4, and today we're going to talk about culture in the Middle Ages. Okay, so first of all, remember how religion was so influential during these medieval times? Well, then it would be no surprise, right, that the architecture is going to be a lot of churches and monasteries. Okay, one of the types of churches that was built during this time is something called a cathedral, very large, and there's two major building styles that were popular during this time: Romanesque and Gothic. So we'll do Romanesque first. So Romanesque, there were very large rectangular buildings, and then the ceilings were rounded. They were called barrel vaults. Okay, and to support that kind of ceiling, they needed to have very heavy, thick, heavy walls and thick pillars very close together to try to support the weight of all that. And they also had very small windows, which made it pretty dark in these churches. Okay, not very much light coming in. All right, and then the other type was Gothic architecture. And Gothic architecture, to not have to have those heavy walls, they came up with a new invention called a flying buttress. And those arches were able to take the weight off, and they were able to have thinner walls and even larger windows. And this is where you see large stained glass windows become popular. And these churches were much taller and had a lot more space. And of course, being a church, right, the stained glass windows are usually showing signs of important teachings from Jesus or parts, from his life. And also the idea was not just to be beautiful, but of course, by letting that light in, that's supposed to be like the light of God. Okay. Another thing that's happened culturally during the Middle Ages is the development of universities. Universities, remember back then that scholars would meet together and study together in different regions. We've talked about that before. So that's kind of how universities started, the gathering of scholars and studying together. And back then, of course, they don't have printing presses yet. So teachers would usually read the information and discuss it with the students, and then the students would have to take notes on slates, their small chalkboards. And that was so there was no textbooks back then, because books were too expensive, because it was so painstaking to write them all out and copy them, until of course the printing press is invented. And then to take a test, again, they don't have paper and pencil much, so they use oral exams. So you study for about, depends, 4 to 6 years. You pass your exams. You could go on if you want. So you get a bachelor's. This is the same as it is today, right? Bachelor's of Arts. And then you can try to get a master's after that. And then if you want to, you can even go for a doctoral degree, but it takes about 10 more years. So the doctoral degrees back then were law, medicine, or theology, which is the study of religion. And of course, that would be a very popular one back then, right? Since religion and church are so important in their lives. And so if you got a doctoral degree, you can, you're at such a high level that now you're considered someone that can, kind of pursue other things. You can teach your topic, or you can go pursue other like scholarly endeavors. So one of the famous monks who did this was Roger Bacon, and I believe you guys have maybe talked about Roger Bacon before. He was switched over to doing some science and experiments and things instead of just theology. Okay, and then that brings us into the new idea of scholasticism. So scholasticism is the idea that you can combine faith and reason. And remember, in this really highly religious time period, usually you're supposed to just rely on your faith, right? You believe because you're taught to and you believe in God and that's the truth and you don't question it and you don't try to understand or reason. And that's different from a lot of other thinkers, right, who thought reasoning was so important. And there, for a long time, there seemed to be like a problem. It was like either or, right? Okay, Anselm is one of the people who was big about there should be a way to reason about God, even though most people thought no, that it was just all belief, right? Part of the influence of this new idea about reasoning was, interestingly, remember how we talked about how unfortunately a lot of copies of ancient works got lost in Europe, but luckily a lot of the Muslim and Jewish scholars had taken the time and preserved a lot of famous works, like, for example, the ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle's works had lost a lot of influence in European thinkers because they hadn't been reading him, right? And then here, these copies eventually get back to Europe through the Muslims and the Jews. And so there's like kind of a resurgence of the Aristotle ideas being talked about. And Aristotle was big on reason instead of faith. And so there's a lot of question about, can you do both, right? Is there a way to have like a happy medium? So Thomas Aquinas, you've, I think, heard of him before too. He was also religious, a friar, and he is probably the biggest person when you talk about scholasticism. He thought he wanted to find a way to do both, right? To use reason, and you could do it. Some things, it depends, right? Like if it was about, if you reasoned but you didn't have faith, you could find out truths about like the physical universe, but not spiritual truths, which kind of does make sense, right? You would need faith to understand spiritual ideas. So he was trying to like reckon the idea of the two of them. Okay, his big work was Summa Theologica, which is basically meaning, right, a summary of theology. And basically he's trying to answer the question, like, does God exist, right? And then how you could try to use reasoning and understand it, okay? So anyway, it's a big topic. I'm not going to go into it too much. One of the things that he's kind of famous for is this idea, though, of natural law. So what he said was there are some things that are like just natural, like you automatically have these rights. They're not given to you by governments. They're things that are like basic rights everyone should have. Like, for example, you have the right to live, right? And that's not given to you by government, or to learn, okay? Or to get married. He thought that was everyone's right, not like government given to you, to worship God, right? So all these ideas he thought were something that were so basic that everyone automatically gets them. And that's true today, right? Like we talk about in our Constitution, everything, there's certain rights like life, liberty, property, right? Or now we switch it to pursuit of happiness, right? So all those basic rights, you can see that's kind of in there. All right, the other thing, and the big thing we want to talk about during this medieval time period was language. So Latin is the scholarly language, right? And so the church, of course, uses Latin, and teachers and high thinkers use Latin. But of course, throughout Europe, there's a lot of different like everyday languages. They call that vernacular, okay? So early English, Italian, Spanish, French, German, all over Europe. These are like the everyday language, but it's not the language of like learning, higher learning, right? So anyway, there's this new push now in the 1100s to start writing literature in the vernacular instead of just writing things in Latin, okay? Remember, originally, too, they didn't write a lot for fun, right? They were writing for a purpose, okay? So now we're switching towards different types of literature that are, of course, they want to be more available to the common people, and so they need to use that vernacular, that common language. So one type, there's two kinds we're going to talk about. One type of vernacular literature is troubadour poetry. So you may have heard of a troubadour before. It's a person, usually in the movies they're singing. They're saying their poems, kind of chanting them or singing them. The poems are usually about love. And remember, at the time, it was like knights. And we talked about, right, like doing the right thing and being a good vassal and respecting ladies, right? So it's all about love. And then the second type of literature that starts getting written is heroic epics. And of course, we've talked about epics before, right? Long stories, and then there's a hero. And then, of course, the heroes at this time period are going to be knights. And again, like doing that service, being a good vassal. The Song of Roland is probably the most famous one. There's this picture right here is showing you someone's interpretation of what it might have been like. It was a story about this knight named Roland who was fighting for Charlemagne against the Muslims. So you can see, we talked about that previously, right? And so you can kind of see. Anyway, so those changes in literature are big. Also, religion, okay? As I mentioned, religion is extremely important. And there is a change during this time period, or for a while. The Catholic Church has gotten so powerful and so rich that actually a lot of people started thinking that, that was bad, like they maybe are getting a little too powerful or a little too corrupt, and that maybe they're forgetting about their original intention of, of the Christian church. And so some people started like trying to go back to the old ways and focus on the important things and not about, the wealth and power, okay? So there's, they call them orders, okay? So a new order was, one of the examples is the Cistercian monks, okay? And they were wanting to go back to a simpler life, so they would farm the land and live separately and pray, and they famously did make some new farming methods and did well with their farming. So they're focusing on the important things, okay? Praying and like just dedicating their life to God, okay? There's also some rise in women joining the orders, right? We've talked about nuns before. Usually you are wealthy, that you have the ability to do this, right? You're not trying to get your family, to support yourselves enough to eat or whatever. Hildegard of Bingen was one of the famous ones. She mostly was famous because she wrote music for the church, which is very unusual. Composers at the time were usually men, so she gets some famous about that. And then there's some other orders of kinds of, like the monks change themselves. The idea of a monk usually is that they live in a monastery separately, right? And they live away from people, and they're just focusing on the religion and the studying and doing their jobs that help, like, copying over famous works and things like that, right? Well, there starts to be a new idea called friars. And friars are different from the other monks in that they went out among the people, and they were more like a missionary, right? And their job is to go spread the word and preach and actually help the poor and go out into the community more. And they were not supposed to have any wealth themselves, so they would rely on others to offer them dinner and help them, right? They will help the poor and things like that. So there's two kinds of friars, orders of friars: Franciscan monks, or friars in this case, and the Dominicans. So we'll talk about each. So Francis of Assisi is the person who started the Franciscans, obviously named after him. And they were the ones that went out and, talked to the people and spread the word. And they were known for how cheerful they were and their love of nature. And then the second big group was the Dominican order, and named after Dominic de Guzman. And this one, again, still life of poverty and everything. And again, their point is to focus on getting back to the basics and really, getting people to understand and follow the church teachings. Okay. All right. So religion is so important that everyone, the majority of people in Europe are Catholic. And so it rules your life, right? You go on Sundays, of course, to church. They call it attending Mass. And of course, the holy days are followed. So nowadays, some people just do like Sunday and then the major holidays. Like my grandma used to go like at least twice a week, right? So it depends. The more religious you are, the more often you go often. So they mention here some terms that you should know just in case. So, for instance, a sacrament was like a ritual that you do, and that's still, they call it the sacraments. Like when you go to church, even today, if you're Catholic, you go to the Mass, and in part of the Mass, they offer the sacrament, and you go, it's called Holy Communion, right? And you go and you get bread and wine. It's supposed to be representative of the wine is his blood, Jesus's blood, and the bread is supposed to be his body. So it's not literally like you're eating him, but more like, you're becoming one with him and you're understanding what he went through for you. So you can only do that at Mass, okay? And that's a ritual, and it's still done today. So that's an example of a sacrament. Another big thing in Catholic Church is the saints, and they thought that the saints were very important, and they would pray to them just like God, kind of trying and today still people do that, and they wear certain medals around their neck and pray to the saints for help in certain areas. Mary was one of the big ones back then, right? The mother of Jesus. But there are a lot of them, and if you in movies and things, sometimes you'll see, or someone has like a St. Christopher medal around their neck or something like that. So anyway, so certain saints were kind of representing to help you in certain topics. All right, but the big thing around this time was that the church was wanting to make sure that people were following the church teachings correctly. And if anyone is talking out against the church teachings, that's called heresy, right? And so heresy was a very, considered morally, right? You were going to hell, and it was so serious, they set up a court called the Inquisition, the Pope did. And they would actually try to root out these people who were heretics, right? People talking out against the teachings, to make sure that they don't have influence. And it got so bad that they actually would, if you were questioned about what you've done, and if you confess and ask for forgiveness, then they don't do anything that bad to you. But of course, they could have tortured you while they're questioning you. So you often would have false, right? People would give in and do it. Also, is a lot of pressure because publicly, right, you and your family would have repercussions. But if you didn't say you were guilty, the punishment could be going to prison. They could take away all of your property, or they could execute you, depending on how bad your crime was. So it did get really bad, right? And that is like the church trying to hang on to its power and root out anyone who is speaking out against them. Okay. And around this same time, we have a lot of problems. We've talked a little bit about, right, there's, unfortunately, the Jews are often the scapegoats. We've talked about that in the past, and it happens again during this time period, that Jews sadly were blamed a lot for things that, of course, like a famine. How are they responsible for that, right? Or a plague. Um, so they're blamed for these things. So there was a big rise in anti Semitism at this time period. And again, they were discriminated against or even sometimes killed. They would try to force them out. They would force them to live in like the worst neighborhoods separate from them called ghettos. They would make rules depending in different places about you can't own land here or you can't practice, you can't be a doctor here or whatever. And it got really bad. Some places even purposely tried to drive them out of their whole country. That is why a lot of Jews ended up in Poland. And of course, we know later in World War II, right, Poland's going to be targeted when the Jews are again targeted again by Hitler. So sadly, the Middle Ages again are also a bad time for the Jews in Europe.